Pepe, Semler,
Here.
Stewart,
Here.
and Councillor Maboop.
Here.
Thank you.
All right, great. We have a quorum, so we'd like to move to our first agenda item tonight, which is a council update. I see we have Councillor Mboop with us. Councillor, would you like to give us an update?
Yes, thank you, Chair Heap. Yeah, I think the most important update was the meeting we had that was directly part of what the planning department was working on. We had a good presentation for about HB 2001, and we had some planning members that were there. It was very interesting. Erik was there, I think Jacob was there too. And so I think it was a very interesting presentation. We went through all the problems we might have and what the planning department was working. Dr. Siegel, Director Siegel was there. And also helped with the presenter who really know what he was talking about. So that was a very important thing. So I think maybe we will discuss that later you will discuss that as the planning department. And the other important thing we discussed was the policing in Lake Oswego. And we had Dr. Ken, I think, here, who's working with the Department of Justice and who had some very interesting data to share about Lake Oswego's policing and Oregon in general and Lake Oswego. We don't have enough data to see how our police is doing, but what we have was kind of very encouraging that our police know that their accountability, and going forward, I think they're gonna work more. They know where they have things to fix, but all in all, if we compare to the rest of Oregon, we are doing well, and that the chief understand that they've some work to do. So that was one important thing. I think that was the most important thing. If Director Siegel has something to say, or Erik and Jacob, no one has.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Mboop, for the update. It was a very good update. Commissioners, any questions for the councillor? None. Thanks, Councillor Mboop, again for the update. Next, we'd like to move on to the citizen comment. This is regarding issues not on the agenda. I'm not aware of anybody that would like to make a citizen comment tonight. Iris, was there anybody that indicated they'd like to make a citizen comment?
No, there were not.
Okay, so we'll move on to item number 5 on the agenda, which is Commission for Citizen Involvement General Updates. So I would like to announce that the Oak Creek Neighborhood Association is conducting their annual meeting tonight. So it's from 7 to 8 p.m. at the Oak Creek Elementary School. So they're inviting all Oak Creek neighbors to come and meet and brainstorm about how they can improve the neighborhood. So if anybody's out there watching tonight, there's still a few minutes to leave to attend the Oak Creek Elementary School if you're in the neighborhood association meeting. So encourage everybody to join. And that was all the updates that I had for the Commission for Citizen Involvement. So we'll move on then to the minutes. We'd like to review the minutes for April 26, 2021. Commissioner, is there any changes or comments that any commissioners have on the April 26, 2021 Plan Commission meeting minutes? Commissioner Stewart?
Yeah, I have one, I guess, clarification on the statement I made on page 4 of the minutes at the end of the paragraph, 4th paragraph from the bottom. where it says he also pointed out that Lake Oswego wasn't a destination and it wasn't likely there would be spikes in rentals. What I was inferring there was that Lake Oswego wasn't a leisure destination, just to clarify that. That's all I have.
Thank you, Commissioner Stewart. Commissioners, any other further changes, or do we wish to accept the minutes with the modifications recommended by Commissioner Stewart?
Yes.
Second.
There's a motion to approve the April 26, 2021 meeting minutes with the suggested changes of Commissioner Stewart, and there's a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any nays? None. Any abstains? None. It's approved. So next on our agenda is a work session. This is on House Bills 2001 and 2003. This is work session number 4. Public comments will be accepted. 5 minutes per individual applies. Anybody that wish to provide comments tonight should have emailed Iris at the email address on the agenda. And I know we did receive some email comments that we got, so we'll recognize those. And then for tonight, the Planning Commission will receive a presentation from staff and Jamin Kimmel of Cascadia Partners summarizing the results of the initial information gathering phase of the city's work to comply with House Bills 2001. The staff coordinator is Erik Olson, senior planner. Planner Olson, would you like to lead us into the discussion tonight?
Yeah, that sounds good. I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right, and so can everybody see that?
Yes, we can see.
Great. All right, so I just have a really brief presentation today, really to preface a longer presentation from our consultant, Jamin Kimmel, the project manager from our consultant team for this project from Cascadia Partners. So I'll just get into just a brief review of what we're here to cover today. So, it was not that long ago, but just to go over some of the results of the study session that we held last week with the City Council. We got direction to look into either minimum compliance or alternative siting and design standards, depending on the standard, but just whatever essentially would be most consistent with the city's sense of place, the character of different neighborhoods, and overall livability consistent with the council goal. We also received confirmation of previous sort of direction that we had talked about with the Planning Commission to not apply for an infrastructure-based time extension request. And we also got direction to establish an ad hoc advisory committee to really provide high-level policy guidance to the Planning Commission, and that's something that we're working on and will be brought to City Council. A resolution to create such an ad hoc advisory committee will be brought to City Council on June 1st. So prior to getting into more of the specifics of the process and outreach component for phase 2, we wanted to really focus today on wrap up of some of the outcomes of the work that we conducted and the research and analysis that was done by Cascadia Partners. And in particular, we wanted to focus on some questions that we'd like to explore a bit more moving forward and that we think are appropriate, I suppose, to explore at this point in the process. So the biggest question I think that we wanted to talk more about was really this question of where to locate middle housing. There is a minimum compliance that sort of a track that is accessible to cities based on state benchmarks for lot size, essentially is most likely how it would apply to Lake Oswego, and that would have the same sort of protections, I guess, as any other strategy that the city could apply, where middle housing would not be required in areas that are protected under statewide planning goals, so areas that are protected under the sensitive lands mapping that we currently have in the city, would be treated similarly to how they are treated for single family homes. The other sort of option would be the performance metric option, and that would be a bit more of a complex process to think about where different types of middle housing would be allowed throughout the city. It would probably be a different type of analysis for different types of middle housing. But we also had some sort of complications that arose, and we started to look into some of the specifics that go along with the performance metric sort of track that's available through the state. And one of those is that it might be difficult to come up with a strategy that meets the equity metric, which essentially requires that one middle housing type other than duplexes or cottage clusters, these sort of higher middle housing types, be allowed on 75% of lots within a particular census block. So actually, I think it's a census block group, to be more specific. So it's a difficult sort of threshold to meet, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that during Jamin's presentation. So again, it's a little bit more complex. So, I think that's something that we would like some guidance a little bit more upfront on. Also, as I mentioned prior, we got direction from City Council and folks at the Planning Commission that were able to join us to look into different alternative siting and design standards that might be most appropriate for the city. So we had some suggestions that were outlined in the Middle Housing Opportunities Report and that Jamin had discussed in his presentation. So we wanted to get a little bit more guidance in terms of where to go, which types of siting and design standards should be explored through the advisory committee process over the summer and sort of refined through that process. And additionally, there were some other strategies that we had talked about in terms of incentives for the preservation of trees, preservation potentially of existing homes, some incentives potentially for context sensitive architectural additions to homes that wouldn't require demolition, and also incentives for affordable housing production. So units that would be affordable to folks earning a particular percentage of area median income. So that's just kind of a preface to a bit more detail that Jamin will get in, but just wanted to point out that these are the things that we would like to get a bit of guidance on moving forward, as you can just kind of keep these in the back of your mind as Jamin goes through his presentation. So with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Jamin to take it away for the second portion of the presentation here.
So Eric, if I may, I think the questions that you've put forward for tonight, just to put them in context, I think they'll be helpful. It'll be helpful to the extent the Planning Commission can provide direction on these questions, as it'll help define the scope for the advisory committee that the council is being asked to appoint. And that's, of course, important with any project, just good project management to have a scope. I don't believe we're asking for really substantive recommendations, from the Planning Commission tonight in terms of design standards or code amendments. That'll be the task of the advisory committee to develop concepts with the consultant and with staff to bring to the Planning Commission for then to develop and vet the code changes that'll take place. So I just wanted to put a little framing around this discussion. I hope that's helpful. Thanks, Eric.
I appreciate that, Scott. I think it's a good way to frame it, that we're really looking at sort of a bigger picture scoping conversation right now, really topics for further exploration more than anything. So with that, yeah, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Jamin.
Great, thanks, Eric. This is Jamin Kimmel. I'm with Cascadia Partners, and I just wanted to first clarify, I didn't put together a separate presentation from the one we went through last week for this group, but I can go into any more detail on any of the topics that we'll cover. So Eric, do you want me to go over the background information as well? I don't know how many of the planning commissioners were also at the joint meeting last week.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good idea. I think some folks were there, but I know that not everybody that's here tonight was able to listen. So you give maybe a brief overview of the background, if possible.
Sure. Yeah, I can do that. Okay. Let me share my screen. Okay. So 3 overall kind of topics I want to go through today. And again, I'll kind of skip forward mostly to our recommendations and some of the key findings coming out of this study, and just give you a quick overview of our process and what the scope of our consultant work was on this project, and how that kind of relates to your larger goal of coming into compliance with House Bill 2001. So our team included Cascadia partners and also a landscape architecture firm, Walker Macy, and an architect, Lawrence Kumar. And so we worked together on this to try to bring both a planning and a design kind of lens to this middle housing issue, because a lot of it has to do with urban design and how you can integrate middle housing into single family neighborhoods. We've been working on this for about the last 6 months or so, and we have been working on both a study of the existing character of Lake Oswego's neighborhoods as a way to kind of provide a base for recommendations about how to best regulate middle housing to kind of fit into that character. And so we did a lot of work on that and did some community engagement that I'll highlight. And then more lately, we've been working on auditing the city's code and comp plan to understand what needs to change to comply with the House Bill 2001. And now we're moving into a phase of working on some alternative implementation options, and we've put that together in the Middle Housing Opportunities Report, which you've seen, and that kind of is our last deliverable as part of this project. And then moving forward, after this meeting, you'll be moving into a phase where you're working on more specific code amendments. But Cascadia Partners and our scope wraps up here this June. So we did some interviews with neighborhood association reps, and also a survey that went out to the entire city to get their input on what's unique about Lake Oswego's neighborhoods, and what are the most important and kind of cherished characteristics of those neighborhoods. And we got a great response on that survey, over 800 responses. We also did 17 different neighborhood association interviews. Here's a little bit of background info on where the survey responses came from in terms of the neighborhoods, and just kind of what the survey types of questions the survey asked. And this is just kind of a fun way to show the some of the keywords that came up in the open-ended questions. And I think we'll highlight this in some recommendations, but it's trees and landscaping and the walkability of neighborhoods. There's a lot of things we heard, and some of that relates to how middle housing fits in to these neighborhoods. Also did some quantitative analysis and mapping of some data, existing conditions data, and field visits. So all of that kind of informed our recommendations, and also an in-depth review of the city's existing comprehensive plan and development code. So we included in our deliverables, or our work products, were a neighborhood character report, a plan and code audit summary report, and then the middle housing opportunities report. So those are 3 work products you received in your packet. And then I'll just pull out some of the key information from each of those. It's important to keep in mind that House Bill 2001 applies to all of the city's residential zones. And so House Bill 2001 applies to any zone that allows single family housing. And in Lake Oswego, that is all the city zones. So this is a kind of a map that consolidates and shows where all those residential zones are mapped today. And Eric touched on this this issue of how does one city comply with House Bill 2001, and the way I like to characterize it is there's kind of two tracks for compliance, and one of them is more straightforward and fairly simple to comply with the rules. Another is more complex and provides more discretion to DLCD to judge your level of compliance. And so those are marked in the green and the orange here. And it depends on which particular zoning standard that the city is proposing. And so it has to do with roughly kind of where middle housing is permitted. And those are those two options that Eric laid out. So there's a minimum compliance provision, minimum compliance provisions related to the minimum lot size and the maximum density that's applied to middle housing. And so there's a set of kind of benchmarks that if the city's zoning standards meet those for minimum lot size and density, then it is in compliance. If this city wants to propose anything separate from those minimum lot size and maximum density provisions, then the application must go through a performance metrics analysis, which shows that not only is that middle housing type located on a minimum percentage of lots citywide, but also that it's allowed throughout the city. Middle housing is allowed in an equitable manner that's distributed. And so that's that 75% of lots in every census block group. And so I'll go into a little more detail on that as we tested that. And then any other standards related to kind of how middle housing is permitted. So things that are in the Lake Oswego's design or dimensional standards now. Any of those, there is also a minimum compliance set of provisions that if the city meets those standards, then they are in compliance. Otherwise, there requires a alternative siting and design standards submittal, which requires a feasibility study to demonstrate that the city's proposed standards do not cause unreasonable cost or delay to middle housing. And so that's where the discretion of that approval comes in. The criteria is unreasonable cost or delay. If the proposed siting and design standards cause that in DLCD's estimation, then the city cannot go forward with those siting and design standards. So those are the two tracks. We'll talk about those as we go through. If I could kind of summarize just broadly what the House Bill 2001 rules allow and do not allow, or maybe a better way to put it is where the city has more flexibility and less flexibility. And the city can generally apply the same minimum lot size standards that applies to single family housing. Same design standards apply to single family housing, same dimensional standards that apply to single family housing. So there is a theme of if the standard is kind of applied equally to single family housing and middle housing, then it's an acceptable under Division 46. That's a general statement. The city can't require generally larger lots, significantly larger lots for middle housing, limit it to a specific area, apply more restrictive design dimensional standards, or require more than one parking space per unit. We'll get into parking a bit more. So the high level summary of our code and plan review is that many different sections of the community development code will need to be amended. So we've highlighted some of those here. So this code update will be fairly significant. Some of the changes will be more minor to some of those chapters. Others will be more significant, and particularly to the standards on, or the sections on dimensional standards and development standards. Those will be quite a bit of changes are anticipated that will be needed in those sections. So here's where we get into that question of the performance metrics approach. So we wanted to test if the city was to take the approach of limiting certain model housing types in certain areas and allowing more or higher density middle housing in other areas, then on what basis would you kind of draw those boundaries or begin to think about where it would make sense to limit those or to limit middle housing? And so we based it on the city's Vision 2035 map from the comprehensive plan, and we looked at this concept of different kinds of centers, and these are places where density is concentrated in these centers. And so if we were to think about these centers a little bit more broadly and think about middle housing as something that would ideally be located closer to these centers, which have services and commercial shops and restaurants, and it can be kind of walkable places, then we might want to concentrate middle housing allowances around those and kind of gradually transition to lower density housing further away. And so that was a idea that we tested, and to see if that kind of concept would comply with the performance metrics standards. And so this is kind of a concept map showing what that might look like. And so we took those centers, and then we drew quarter mile and half mile buffers out from each of those centers, and analyzed how many tax lots would be covered if the city was to, say, limit higher level middle housing types. So for example, quadplexes and townhouses, for example, might be limited to those tax lots that are within a half mile of these center areas. And that approach generally would meet the first test of a performance metric approach to complying with House Bill 2001, and that is that the minimum percentage of lots citywide where each middle housing type must be allowed, and that ranges from 60 to 80%. But as you can see here, with a percentage of tax lots within a half a mile is close to 80%. And so this approach could potentially work to meet that standard. What gets more complicated is that the second test under the performance metric track is that 75% of the lots in each census block group must allow at least one higher level middle housing type. And so we ran those numbers for each census block group. And as you can see, the census block groups are outlined here in gray. And the pink number is the percentage of lots in that block group that would be covered in that half mile buffer area where those higher level middle housing types would be allowed. And the challenge is you have too many areas which are just outside of that half mile buffer. You don't cover enough of each census block group with this approach in order to meet that test of at least 75% of lots in every census block group. So each of these block group numbers that are bounded with the black box are block groups that would not comply, and so changes would have to be made to make that work in each of those block groups. So our overall finding from this exercise is that meeting that performance metric threshold in this way, where the approach is to limit middle housing in certain areas based on a certain location criteria and allow it more outside of those areas, would be very difficult to meet, just because primarily of this census block group requirement. And so given that, our recommendation in the Middle Housing Opportunities Report is that the city focus on meeting the minimum compliance standards for minimum lot size and density. And this approach is more consistent with the overall intent of House Bill 2001, which is that all of these middle housing types can be integrated within many different kinds of neighborhoods, and that all neighborhoods should have a wider mix of housing types. It's kind of an underlying premise of the whole legislation. And so the focus would be more on the form and design of middle housing, and less on its location or the density on any particular site or lot. This would also be administratively much simpler and would be less likely to be challenged either by DLCD or legally by an outside group that felt that the city's performance metrics analysis was invalid for any reason. Because it's more complex, just opens up the opportunity for that to be challenged, and there's some more judgment involved in complying with the more complex criteria. So I wanted to focus a little bit more on this presentation. I added a few slides from the joint meeting last week to give you a sense of what it would look like to comply with the minimum compliance standards for lot size. And so this chart shows what those minimum compliance standards are. And so how it's actually set up is that the minimum lot size that the city can apply to middle housing, there's a cap set on it. And it is in part based on the minimum lot size for a single family house in that same zone. Again, with the idea that there's some parity between single family housing and middle housing and how they're treated by the zoning code. And so first off, for duplexes, the city cannot require any lot size that is higher than the single family lot size, regardless of the size of the single family minimum lot size. For triplexes and quadplexes on smaller lots, the city can require a somewhat higher minimum lot size than the single family minimum lot size. So for example, if there was a zone where the city allows for a single family house to be on a 4,000 square foot lot, the city could require a 5,000 square foot lot for a triplex. But if the city requires anything above a 5,000 square foot lot for a single family house, they cannot require a larger lot size for a triplex. So basic basic same approach to quadplexes and cottage clusters. Essentially, unless the city allows the single family houses on a lot that are less than 7,000 square feet, then the lot must be no greater than the single family minimum lot size. And then townhomes are slightly different. There's just a flat standard of 1,500 square feet per townhome. So kind of what that then looks like in Lake Oswego zones. So I've pulled in these tables from the Middle Housing Opportunities Report to just give you a more concrete sense of the difference, what it would look like to comply with those minimum compliance provisions, and where you have some flexibility to deviate from those slightly. And so we laid out two options in the Middle Housing Opportunities Report that are separate from the performance metrics track. So that was option 1. This is option 2 and 3. And so option 2 would be to require larger lots for middle housing to the extent that the city can. And so you see, based on those minimum compliance thresholds we just covered, the city can't require a larger lot for most middle housing types, or any middle housing type really, in the lower density zones, so R15 and R10 and R7.5. In some of the higher density zones, the city can require a slightly larger lot than what is required for single family housing. So the lot size can scale up for middle housing, but again, up to the maximum of 7,000 square feet, basically, for a quadplex or cottage cluster, and 5,000 for a triplex. So this option 2 table here would be the minimum lot size standards that would apply if the city was to move forward with the minimum compliance provisions, and to do so, maximizing the size of lots that are required for each middle housing type. Another approach and way to think about this that we outlined in the report would be, this is in option 3 here, to essentially to require that middle housing be generally, the minimum lot size be generally equivalent to a single family minimum lot size. And so the idea here is, well, in some of these low or higher density zones, let's take for an example the R5 or R6 zone. Does it really make sense to require another 1,000 square feet for a quadplex when a triplex, or excuse me, like a triplex or quadplex over the 6,000 square feet that's required for a single family home? And under this kind of idea, there's basically, in all of the zones, the approach is the same, is that middle housing and single family housing are allowed on the same minimum lot size. So there is a benefit to this that, one, in that middle housing would be treated the same in all zones, which may be advantageous from kind of a fairness or equity perspective. The other advantage might be that the minimum lot size would allow for middle housing development on more lots. And so there would not be neighborhoods which experience more or less middle housing development simply because there are more or less lots in that neighborhood that where middle housing is allowed based on the minimum lot size. So there's one kind of nuance in here when you apply minimum lot size for townhouses. And so I wanted to bring this up from the code audit report as well. And that is that the city is allowed to apply a maximum density to townhouses. And they cannot apply a maximum density, though, to duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, or cottage clusters. And so those are simply exempt from any maximum density provisions. Though for townhouses, the city can require it must be at least the maximum density the city applies to townhouses must be at least 4 times the maximum density that applies to a single-family dwelling, or 25 units per acre, and whichever is less of those. And so what this does is in lower density zones, so let's take, for example, this table kind of shows you what the maximum density that could be applied in each of those zones to townhouses. And so, for example, in the R10 zone, minimum lot area is 10,000 square feet per unit. That equates to a maximum density of 3.5 units per acre. And so what that equates to in terms of the maximum density that can be applied to townhouses is 13.9 units per acre. And so if you would apply a density of 13.9 units per acre to a townhouse project, then your effective kind of average lot size would need to be about 2,500 square feet. And so even though the minimum compliance standards say 1,500 square feet per townhome on average, if you apply a maximum density in these lower density zones, it would effectively require a slightly larger lot. And so to kind of visualize this, if you think about a 10,000 square foot lot, you would probably have maybe some of if 4 townhomes on that lot, then you would have some of the exterior lots, the end units might have some larger lots, and then the middle units might have some smaller lots, but they would kind of average out to about 2,500 square feet. So that's where in these lower density zones, there is some ability to require a slightly larger townhouse lot than 1,500 square feet. As you get into some of the higher density zones, then this 25 units per acre kicks in, and effectively the minimum lot size then would govern, and so the 1,500 square feet per lot would then come into play. You can cover that again if you have some questions. It gets a little bit tricky, but the overall idea is townhouses, you can regulate density, others you cannot. So we'll quickly through the rest of these because we covered this in the report and have a little less to do with your task today. But one of the things we did, like I mentioned, was to try to understand how character varies throughout Lake Oswego and to map and try to describe the character of various neighborhoods. And one thing that we found is that while each neighborhood has slightly different character and development patterns, there are some broader areas that are very similar. And so we mapped some of those areas and labeled them character areas for the purpose of the report, and described each of those in terms of how they vary in their natural features, the streets, and circulation patterns, the lot patterns, and the form of an architecture of buildings. And so I think these character profiles can give you a good base of information for the city to take these minimum compliance standards that you must comply with and to tailor them to each of the individual character areas in the city and make sure that any proposed standards for middle housing can help to shape middle housing in a way that fits in with the existing character. And one of those factors that affected character a lot is the era that the neighborhood developed. So we looked at some data to help us inform that. And this is speaking to, I think, our approach to try to look at both some of the more quantitative data and also qualitative data, and going out into the field and really considering what things look like on the ground. So this is a couple of snippets from the report, so you get a sense for what's covered. We also cover some variations in more architectural details as they vary throughout the city. So a few things that popped up in our neighborhood character survey that we found to be very important across the city, and I'll talk about that now. And those were trees and the natural landscape were very important. And we heard that a lot in our interviews with residents and in the survey, and so we have some recommendations around that. There is the opportunity that middle housing, in the way that you cite it on the lot, and the opportunity to make it more economically attractive to have smaller units. If you have smaller, more units on a lot, this actually may make tree preservation more viable. And so I think it's important for the city to consider how can they use the zoning code to try to incentivize tree preservation more effectively. And some options there might be something like a lot coverage bonus or a floor area bonus for developments that preserve a certain number of trees. Landscaping, we also heard quite a bit about as being important and really helping for infill development to kind of fit in with the existing neighborhoods. And so we had some recommendations there on kind of elevating the city's front yard and foundation landscaping standards. We heard a bit about that the size of houses and the size of buildings in kind of proportion to their lots is really maybe more important for most people in most neighborhoods than it is about details of the architectural style or materials that are used in buildings. And so we took a look at some of the city's existing code standards around the bulk and size of buildings, so side yard setback planes and the limits on the depth of buildings. And we think those address many of those key issues that people are concerned about, but there might be some minor changes that would be appropriate to that. A kind of universally held view from the survey and from our outreach was that the houses where the facade is really dominated by the garage was not viewed favorably by most people. And so the city has some controls now on front-facing garages and design standards to address that, but there could be some ways to further control for that and to encourage rear-loaded garages, for example, rather than front-facing garages. And then when garages are front-facing, to help them to kind of blend into the facade more and not be so prominent. In the case of parking, we heard quite a bit about parking in the survey and in our outreach and concerns about that. One of the challenges to parking is that the minimum compliance provisions require that essentially that the city not require more than one space per unit, but the city's current standards are between 1 and 1.5 spaces per unit. And so the city would need to either reduce their parking requirement for middle housing, or they'd have to go through the alternative siting and design standards process. And In regards to parking, we believe that alternative siting and design standards process, which requires a financial analysis to justify the higher requirement and to show that there would not be any unreasonable cost or delay that can be attributed to the higher parking requirement. And we believe that would be very difficult for the city to prove. There's a fairly direct connection between parking requirements and the cost of development and the cost of housing. And so our recommendation is to meet the minimum compliance for standards for off-street parking. But we recognize that there are many areas in Lake Oswego that don't have on-street parking, and for which middle housing may have more impacts than single-family housing does if the minimum parking requirements are reduced. Lastly, or second to last, we recommend the city also focus on encouraging conversions and additions to single-family houses in order to create new middle housing. And so there are ways the city can try to make it more attractive to keep an existing house and add to it, or add on an existing a lot that has an existing house in a way that might be more context sensitive than a complete tear down and rebuild to create a middle housing product. So there are, similar to the recommendation around trees, we think a floor area bonus, a lot coverage bonus, other concepts like that would make it more attractive to keep an existing house and then add to it, or convert it to create, let's say, a duplex or a triplex, would be likely to be more context sensitive and kind of better fit with the neighborhood. And lastly, we suggest you focus on some incentives for new middle housing to include affordable units. So the city has some existing financial incentives for affordable housing units, but they would not apply to middle housing because they are set to only apply to multifamily projects that include 20 or more units. And so some tweaks to that to make it viable for, let's say a small cottage cluster project with 10 units to receive a financial incentive if they include affordable units. And then lastly, some other regulatory incentives similar to the other topics we covered to include affordable units. So that might look like a density bonus or a floor area bonus. Okay, I think that's it. And we can focus in on any other topics, or I can bring up any sections of the report if you have some specific questions on the work products.
Thank you, Jim. Commissioners, questions for Jamin? Commissioner Lee?
Well, it kind of puts the kibosh on one of the big concerns a lot of us have had about off-street parking in Lake Oswego with middle housing. That if we're only mandated to have one off-street parking space per unit, that spills the rest of the parking onto the streets.
Yeah, let me pull back up the specific that slide, because the criteria might help to illuminate some things. So what the criteria say is that the city, in order to have a parking requirement that's more than one space per unit, would need to put together a feasibility study. Our recommendation is that study is unlikely to be approved. Although if the city could perhaps design it in a way so that there is an attempt to minimize the difference between the proposed standard and the minimum compliance standard. So, for example, perhaps in some areas, the current standard would still be required for middle housing in 1 to 1.5 spaces per unit. But in other areas, you might allow 1 space per unit. So that could be based on where on-street parking is available. And so there might be some approaches like that where the city could try to address those impacts in those areas where there is no on-street parking, and there'd be more of an impact. And that might make it more likely for DLCD to be able to approve a alternative standard.
And, you know, something else to consider is that when we look at required parking, we're only looking at space that's available that is not within a setback, a front setback, for example. So if the code requires a minimum setback of 20 feet, you know, you may have the driveway space there and you may be able to park there, but that space doesn't count toward the minimum requirement. So in actuality, you know, you would have the ability to put a car in that space on your driveway, and you would also have the space that is meeting the minimum parking requirement, and possibly some garage space as well. So it's not as though there is only going to be 1 parking space on every lot that is middle housing. Even on those lots that are just meeting the minimum requirement, you know, the likelihood is that they'll have additional parking. And then the market may, you know, builders just may want to provide more parking because that's what consumers are looking for in a townhome or, you know, in a duplex situation, for example. So anyway, so I just wanted to, you know, make a point on that. And then I think that the alternatives that Jamin is suggesting as a way to have a more customized parking standard, the commission may want to weigh in on whether that's something that we ought to pursue.
Thank you.
There are some neighborhoods with very narrow streets where we just cannot force parking onto the street. And we should look at those specific neighborhoods, specific streets, and relax the standards there to allow more than 1 car.
Thank you, Commissioner Beckett. Commissioners, other questions? Jamin, I had one question on the townhome when you were showing the table on density. And I think it was showing a factor of 4. I was just wondering, yeah, how does that translate? Like, I wasn't following the Division 46 required max density for townhomes, that second to last column from the right. Was that the multiplier by 4? It doesn't seem to equate. I just wasn't following what that Division 46 was.
Yeah, that is by 4. Yeah, the only difference is that, so this is the, there's a lot of minimum and maximums that get thrown around when you're now talking about this. So the maximum density that the city can apply, and it is 4 times the maximum density that is applied to a single family house. So it is multiplied by 4, but that is up until you get, if it's over 25 units per acre, then the city only has to apply a maximum density of 25 units per acre. And so the idea there is that the city doesn't have to, well, first off, we should say that the city doesn't have to apply a maximum density to townhouses. If the city was to apply it, then they can apply up to 4 times what is applied to single family or 25 units per acre, and it's whichever is less. And so what I put in here, it is 4 times this maximum density, but then once you get above 25 units per acre, I just converted that to 25 because, well, except for this one, it looks like I missed, but of 27.9 here. Does that make sense?
there's some rounding differences. it
Yeah,
looks
that's
like.
what I was kind of looking
Yeah.
at, but I assume there was just a little bit of
Yeah,
a
yeah.
rounding difference. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So it really only matters, I think, in these lower density zones. That would effectively require a larger average lot size for your kind of than would be required in the other higher density zones.
Okay. Thanks. Commissioners, other questions? If there's no other questions, I would like to open it up for a public comment tonight. Iris, was there anybody that indicated they'd like to make a public comment tonight?
No, there were not.
I would like to acknowledge that we did receive an email from one individual who gave feedback on the minimum parking requirements. So we did receive that email. Commission has read through it.
I have a question for Mr. Kimmel.
Sure, go ahead, Commissioner Beckett.
We have lots of waterfront property, both on the lake and on two rivers. Can we apply different standards to those?
Can you apply different standards to those? Is that, sorry,
Yes.
I didn't get the
because
question.
Can we apply different standards to those? Because for a waterfront, you have to allow certain space back for flooding, for boats, and so on, and that takes up lot size that otherwise could go to housing.
Certainly, yeah. So long as that same standard applies to middle housing, or that also applies to single family housing. If it's the same standard that applies to both, then there's no, generally no problem with it.
Yeah, and I would
Does that
also
make sense?
that we do have existing standards, in our existing code that would require that setback currently for single family residences. So that would, that sensitive lands designation would continue to, apply to new middle housing development as it does today to single family residences.
Yeah, one other thing on sensitive lands, if a property is fully encumbered by sensitive lands or nearly fully encumbered, the code provides for sort of a safe harbor, if you will, that notwithstanding the allowed density, if it's a larger parcel, you're only permitted to develop the equivalent of one single family detached home in terms of lot coverage, square footage, floor area. So that's a control on development right there in sensitive lands. So, if the code is now allowing middle housing in those areas, there's going to be a control on just how much floor area and lot coverage you're going to get, even if it's a very large lot.
Vice Chair Pepe, question?
Yeah, thank you. Great report, and summarizing it for us. In regards to trees and the city having historical society identifying trees that have great importance to the city, as well as some other aspects, how will that play into should a developer come, the lot has quite a few trees on it? Maybe this can also go to Director Siegel as well. Developer comes in and we'll say the large majority of whatever the quantity of trees on site will need to be removed. The neighborhood association objects to that. How does that play out regarding the specific requirements of the House bill that we're talking about?
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Pape. It's a really good question. So the standard, as I understand it, in the rules, Division 46, that's basically establishes this principle where middle housing, shall not be regulated or restricted more than single-family housing. That's just shorthand for, I think, what the rules say.
Sure.
Well, we would interpret that to mean that the development that's permitted under the tree code would be, it would be comparable, so that if the zone allows, development within established setbacks, not to exceed maximum lot coverage and floor area, so on and so forth, middle housing will have to work within those same limits. And so the tree code then looks at what does the zoning permit? What development is permitted by the zone? So if tree removal is necessary to construct a single family home, which is permitted by the zone, then it's likely it would also be necessary to for construction of middle housing. But I don't think the bill opens up any more tree removal than what our code currently allows. So will there be more pressure to remove trees? Yeah, I think there could be, because middle housing quadplexes, for example, may reach the limits of what our zoning allows more readily than a single family home would, although we do see quite a few single family homes that go right up to the limit in terms of lot coverage. And the code doesn't limit it, well, with a few exceptions, it doesn't limit the amount of area that can be covered by patios, outdoor living spaces that are paved essentially. Some of the zones do limit impervious surfaces, but that's not a citywide standard. So, that's considered construction or development that's permitted by the zone, and therefore a justification for removing trees. So I think what this exercise or this audit of our code is going to tell us is that we may want to re-examine the limits of development for all forms of residential development if tree removal is a concern. I mean, if it's a concern with middle housing, then it would be a concern with single family development and vice versa. So I think this is a real key issue that we're going to need to drill down into as we move forward.
So if I may carry on with that, Director Siegel, is it safe to say then, for middle housing, when they want to come in and put a development, cottage, cluster, duplex, triplex, townhouse, they still have to abide by the zoning and the rules and regulations governing that specific parcel of land? There isn't really an exception that they can, unless they apply maybe for a variance, move outside of that building envelope and or remove another tree or what have you. Is that, or go into a floodplain?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are two different things there. So the floodplain, or what are called goal protected areas, natural hazard areas, sensitive lands, historic resources.
Right.
There's no entitlement or greater allowance of development or destruction of those resources under the bill. The bill affords the same level of protection that we currently have for those resources. For individual trees, our tree code, I go back to the tree code, which it does permit removal of trees that are necessitated by construction that's permitted by the zone. So that's really those are the sideboards that we have on tree removal. I think, and I just wanted to mention the incentives or encouragement that Jamin was referring to for preserving trees or retaining existing structures, remodels over tear downs. All of these tools that you might consider are not intended to allow more middle housing than what the bill would naturally require us to allow. These are really devices that I think are meant to help us get to outcomes that the community would value, provided that middle housing is going to occur, or if it is going to occur, how can we steer that in a way that has positive outcomes?
Attorney Boone, did you have a comment?
I just wanted to follow up on Director Siegel's comment. We've had past cases in which the question has been raised as to whether in a tree peel, whether we can require the applicant to reduce the size of the house, to change the house proposed meets the requirements, but the question is, can we require them to reduce the size? And the council has said no, that the applicant, as Director Siegel indicates, has the right to construct a development allowed by the code. So the point is is that I concur, based upon the current language in the tree code, that we couldn't require them to say, you can't have a middle housing thing, you have to have a single family housing, and we hope that would be less square footage type of thing. If they're permitted to develop in the code, that use in the code, then they're permitted. So, and they just have to comply with the dimensional requirements.
Yeah, if I could just follow through on the thought too, because it's hard to visualize this or to really think about it in terms of actual construction. And the reality is that on the smaller lots, or the zones that have the smaller lot sizes, the floor area standards are going to control really how much middle housing is likely to occur there. So, in an R5 zone, for example, where the minimum lot size is 5,000 square feet, and in Jamin's analysis, it tells us that we're not obligated to allow any smaller than, lots that are any smaller than that, with the exception of townhomes. That when you apply the maximum floor area standard, lot coverage and height, if you were to try to develop a quadplex on one of those lots, the units are going to be very small. I mean, which could be a positive outcome if what we're trying to achieve is more affordable, with a lowercase a, more economical housing. If the market actually shows that it pencils out, these are not going to be McMansions. They're going to be scaled down accordingly, according to lot size and floor area standards. So anyway, just wanted to try to put that into context.
Vice Chair Pepe.
This question might also be more geared toward Senior Planner Olson and how involved and in depth he's gotten into this bill. But is there anything I haven't seen or any discussions regarding the purchasing of the property at how am I trying to say this? Are there any levers within the bill that if someone were to apply to purchase a piece of property and want to put in quadplexes or middle housing, if you will, where an existing single family structure is currently built, that they would get a reduced price on that piece of property? Or is it still at market rate? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so there's nothing in the bill that would provide for that I've heard of, at least. Yeah, there's nothing that would, at least based on the state's requirements and what they've outlined, that would involve that.
Okay, so the homes around the lake or the homes around on the river, or some others in the general area, their values are significantly higher because of where they're situated. They're not looking at potentially being having their property reduced in value should someone want to come in and put a plan to put middle housing on their half acre or 1 or 1.5 acre piece of property. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, the bill doesn't directly regulate prices or property values or rents or anything of that nature. It's definitely not a rent control bill or anything like that. It really only regulates the development code, and so there could be some impact on property values as a result of generally as a result of this, but it's hard to say whether that'll be positive or negative, or how that'll play out in various locations.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Commissioner Sumler.
Just wondering, and I don't have much architectural experience with a triplex or a quadplex, but Senior Planner Olson or Director Siegel, but how would ADA apply to these housing developments, especially if you're going to renovate an existing home and all of a sudden, is it that one unit would then need to basically 25% of units within a 4 greater unit building need to be ADA compliant, but then all need to be potentially accessible by egress and stuff like that. I'm just wondering how you guys have been approaching this or thinking about this, and if it applies at all.
Yeah, I can try to respond to that, Commissioner Semler. I think, with the ADA, as you're aware, there are provisions in the guidelines that have you move toward compliance, full compliance when it's an existing structure and you're remodeling. And so, I think I think that principle would apply in the conversion of an existing home, which is not subject to, ADA accessibility requirements. The bill itself has had direction in it to the state building codes division to develop rules or building code standards for specifically for conversions. And so I'll take a look at that with our building official and try to do that before our next meeting so we can have a more informed discussion about this, because I think there's some allowance in that set of state building codes that gives the building official some direction or authority to approve alternate means and methods of construction. And I don't know if that extends to ADA or not. Probably not, because it's federal law, but I think that's the general idea, though, that you move toward compliance in an existing building.
Gotcha. Okay. Just interested, but thank you.
Yeah.
Commissioner Stewart?
Yeah, I might be able to answer that question a little bit. What Commissioner Semler was asking about. The American with Disabilities Act doesn't, as I understand, doesn't apply so much to what would be low density development, which, I think a duplex, a triplex or a quadplex, or, those sorts of things would qualify as what you're talking about is the Fair Housing Act, which is more of an issue of adaptability, which means that if it's a for rental property, somebody wants to move in who has accessibility issues or concerns, the landowner, the homeowner would have to, by law, adapt the house to accommodate the individual. But again, I think that happens when you're talking about maybe 10 or more units on a site. So I suspect that that wouldn't necessarily apply to duplexes, triplexes, or quadplexes or things like that.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Stewart. That's right. There is a threshold for the number of units, and I'll ask our building official about that so we can report back.
Thank you. Commissioner Fisher?
General, though, it's good to have some direction for that. There are some opportunities to explore, accessible design, and we will actually be talking a bit with the 50 Plus Advisory Council. So, it's definitely something that we, will look into the specifics of, but could also think about, exploring further with the advisory committee.
Right now, and what I was speaking of was specifically with regards to the building code. A homeowner or a developer may opt to do something different.
Thanks. Commissioner Fisher?
Planner Olson, I seem to recall there was some discussion about exempting existing homeowners associations from this bill. Am I incorrect on that? And if it is true that they are, the thing that Mr. Kimmel presented showed that most of the city was eligible, in theory, to be to be redeveloped. But if a homeowners association, for example, restricts every house has to be single family, does the state law override that? Or, it seems to me that we have a whole bunch of homeowners associations, and would we then say, well, we carve out X area because it's got these existing rules? And I guess that's also part of Attorney Boone explaining whether or not state law overrides those homeowners associations. So I guess the first question is there an exemption in the bill for the homeowners associations that exist? And if the answer is yes, then I guess the rest of my stuff is irrelevant.
Well, so the way that it would work is that it's not necessarily anything specific to homeowners associations, but any lots where there are existing restrictions, CC&Rs that go along with a lot that would prohibit middle housing. And a lot of times those do go along with a homeowners association. Those can be sort of, one and of the same, but they don't always go hand in hand. Some homeowners associations may not have those restrictions in their CC&Rs. And, there might be CC&Rs in areas that don't have homeowners associations covering them that would also prohibit middle housing. So it is a lot of research to sort of look into specifically all the parcels where those would apply or those CC&Rs would apply. It is an interesting question whether to consider that as we look to the areas of the city where we would theoretically permit middle housing. We're not required by the state to exempt those areas from our sort of landscape of lots to look at for this purpose, because there is, these are sort of private agreements. They could change with time. So the zoning would still have to sort of allow for middle housing, whereas if there's a CC&R that existed prior to the bill being adopted, it would continue to sort of hold in those areas. But there is always an opportunity for these legal agreements to be changed or modified in the future. So it's difficult to sort of plan on these types of issues when it comes to the CC&Rs. But it's an interesting question because I think, as you have pointed out, it might be creating sort of a false stock of middle housing when it comes to when we say we're allowing housing in specific areas of the city. That we could also have CC&Rs that would sort of usurp the city requirements.
I agree, and I guess I would just amplify that. Oh, am I on? Yeah, I would agree, and I would amplify that. The bill basically addresses what are the impediments to middle stock housing. Okay? Well, one of them is a zoning. So it goes through and it says, all right, you need to allow middle stock housing wherever you allow single family housing. Okay. Another impediment could be covenants. Now, this doesn't mean that the city needs to plan around covenants. I mean, we have existing cases, of course, where we allow certain uses in property, and there may be some underlying covenants that don't. But those that doesn't affect our zone. That doesn't affect our ability to put the zone on the property. There are defenses to enforcement of covenants. Waiver is a big one, but there are others. And so whether those covenants are enforceable, that's a private matter, as Planner Olson has indicated. And so I think in our planning regulatory function, whether or not there are underlying covenants, I don't think should play a role in it. Per our compliance with the House bills, we will satisfy the House bills if we provide for the opportunity. Whether they actually get constructed or not, that could be dependent upon the covenants, and that can change in the future as the covenants could change. The property owners could decide to remove the covenants. So we have no control over that. That's not within our purview.
Thank you.
Maybe one direct question to Jamin, following up on Commissioner Fisher's question. So the map that we're currently looking at, did that incorporate homeowners associations at all? At first glance, it appears to. If I look at like Mountain Park, it looks like there's an island of white there. In the sections of Palisades, where I'm familiar with some homeowners associations, it looks like there's kind of an island of white there too. So did the map that you're showing account for any HOAs?
No, it did not. No, so
Okay.
I'm not familiar with those two areas that you pointed out, but generally this shows all of the city's residential zones,
Okay.
regardless of any underlying HOAs that are in place.
Right. Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, and I wanted to also just add that, clarify that any new covenants, conditions, and restrictions that are put in place cannot prohibit middle housing. That was addressed in the law. So existing prior to I think it was end of 2019, is permitted, but any new restrictions are not permitted.
All right, thank you. Vice Chair Pepe?
Mr. Kimmel, staying on this map here as well, and comparing this map to a different, I believe it was more of a heat map that you were showing, and it showed the percentage of the maybe there was one that showed the percentage of that neighborhood that would comply. This one. Did you take into account in comparing this map to the other one? It looks like the properties that are unincorporated or have not yet been annexed into the city do not have to comply or do not have to comply with House Bill 2001. Is that correct?
I think you're muted, Jamin.
Yes, we did take that into account. So this whole analysis was based on only properties in the city, and so that's where these numbers come from. If the properties that are any property that's not in the city now, that's in those county areas, but are in your growth management area, would not be subject to the city's middle housing requirements, but would be subject to the county's middle housing requirements, which might be slightly different. And so this analysis did consider that. So this only includes the city lots.
Okay.
So just again on what this map is showing, Jamin, right, is that it's telling us the percentage of each census block group or area that would achieve, like what percentage of the lots in that area that are in the city that would allow middle housing that are within, based on this simulation or this test that you did, right? And each of these areas would have to meet the 75% threshold in order for this scenario to be compliant. And what it's showing is that this scenario doesn't fly. There may be other scenarios that would work. And I also would be interested in, how those percentages would change as we annex more properties. Probably not much. I mean, we don't annex properties very, very quickly. We don't annex very many at any one time. And in those areas that we are annexing property, those are areas that are not within a quarter or a half mile from those centers. So, it would only drag down the numbers, I think, as we annex more land. So, it's really the question is, should we be testing these kinds of scenarios and looking for one that would be compliant, that, excludes certain areas of the city from having to comply, or should we be following a different track that looks more of a, more at an even distribution of the lots across the city and all the neighborhoods based on lot size as the key criterion? And, the advisory committee, we'd rather have the planning commission provide some initial direction on that choice rather than having the advisory committee, really spend a lot of time on it, because it's a high level policy issue.
So thank you. The second part or second piece of my question, if it's okay, in one of your other maps showing the different centers. Yes, thank you. Did this take into account transit at all? And I know that bus stops could absolutely change and move, but at a snapshot in time right now, if they were to stay the same, does this, are these centers at all based off of where transit stops are?
I'm actually not totally sure. We didn't directly incorporate transit because we based this on the city's 2013 plan, which identified these centers. I think they are related in some way to where transit is on some of the major corridors in the city, but I'll let Scott or Eric pitch in with that.
Yeah, that's correct. The centers, the neighborhood villages and the cultural, no, actually not the cultural nodes, but the neighborhood villages, the town centers, Lake Grove and downtown, and the employment centers are all areas that have TriMet bus routes. So I think in each of those areas, you would find at least one, one or more bus stops. There are bus stops, elsewhere throughout the community around, around the lake on South Shore and up Kerr Parkway, and the bus stops in town. And those other bus stops that are not within these centers were not used in the model. So if you were to expand the model to include those bus stops as an indication of access to transit and places where higher density housing ought to be located, that would be another scenario. That you could run that.
Okay, thank you.
I had a quick question for Mr. Kimmel. I was just wondering if you and your team at Cascadia are working with other cities doing the same process, and are you and those other cities coming to similar conclusions? I mean, it seems to me, and this is just me, that at first glance, it could be best to just go with the minimum compliance and not try and change the rules. And are other people really finding that out themselves, or are there different outcomes?
Sure. Yeah. From the sense I get from both of the, I'm working with one other city full time, and then supporting two others, and none of those are, as of now, pursuing this performance metrics approval or the alternative siting and design standards. Yet they are all going for the minimum compliance. So that is to say, I don't know that there may be other cities that are also considering it. I'm just not aware of, but I'm not aware of others that are considering it right now. We did a similar analysis on the performance metrics approach for another city, and also found that it was very difficult to limit middle housing really in any particular location while also meeting that that census block group standard. So it is tricky, and one of the more tricky things I think about it that some cities are that dissuade some cities from doing it is some of these limitations that you might want to apply. So for example, let's say that you might want to allow townhouses and quadplexes within a half mile of these centers. Well, the kind of area that's a half mile from each of these centers probably doesn't follow your existing zone district boundaries. It might not follow any of your existing overlay zones. So you might need a new overlay zone. You might need to modify the boundaries of your base zone or create a new base residential zone. So it gets administratively more complex, and that's just one thing I think that's dissuaded some from looking at it. I think it's pretty hard to limit middle housing significantly in any particular census block group. And for that reason, cities have found that they'd rather be less concerned about the location of middle housing and have it be more driven by the lot size and have it be a lot by lot determination of whether any particular middle housing types allowed.
Got it. Yeah, I mean, I can only, just looking at this map alone, I can only speak for myself, but we live in a census tract where 100% would be eligible for middle housing. And if other neighborhoods were exempt because of other reasons, I think I could see myself and others in our neighborhood or other neighbors being upset, like, why didn't we qualify not to be, in that group? And I can imagine from a citywide perspective that it behoove everyone to be in the bucket than most, if not all, and some being excluded. But anyway, that's just me. But thank you.
Commissioner Stewart.
So is it safe to say that if we opt to follow the minimum compliance track, we have a path towards compliance according to HB 2001 But if we choose to follow the performance track, we still need to come up with a scenario to meet HP 2001. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think for the scope of this project so far, we tested out one option, which is kind of basing it around some of these centers. But we did not test multiple different scenarios. So that would be the next step going forward, is if you wanted to pursue this approach of limiting housing in certain areas, then you would need to probably run several different scenarios and options and find one that that works. If you went the other route of the minimum compliance, then it's pretty clear the guardrails on your decisions about minimum lot size and maximum density. It's definitely a less complex decision making process.
And I think, just to add to what Jamin was saying, I think it's really hard to think about not only strategies that make sense, and we could come up with sort of a logic around, for instance, the center's approach. You can sort of go down these roads for a while without really knowing whether or not you comply, and you might land in a place that, doesn't end up complying at the end of the day. So it's hard not to sort of engineer it backwards, and it's very difficult to think about what that criteria would be of why we would, as a city, say we're limiting it in certain areas and not others. And so I think that's going to be really difficult to make that decision at this sort of fine grain, but also we land at the 75% of the lots in all census block groups as well.
Commissioners, any other questions? I see none. Erik, is there any questions that or feedback that you would like more specifically from the commissioners tonight, or should we conclude Jamin's presentation?
Yeah, I think it's good to hear some initial thoughts on the performance metrics. Just in general, if there's anything where we've certainly heard trees and sort of some interest in pursuing regulations related to trees potentially. But if there's anything else that planning commissioners wanted to point out as a topic that they think should be a focus of the advisory committee, and that we should really look into further when it comes to particularly the alternative siting and design standards, and which ones we would want to really think a lot more about. I think that would be helpful, just sort of general thoughts and comments.
Commissioner Stewart?
I thought I heard earlier in the presentation that staff was looking for us to kind of nudge the committee or staff in one of these two directions. Is that what we're going for here?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to this performance metrics question, I think that's where it would be best to get direction on that higher level policy level, as opposed to having that be something that the advisory committee would look into further. But yeah, I think generally we just like to sort of pick out topics for the advisory committee to sort of then whittle away at further and really come up with some more refined recommendations for.
Well, one thing that I heard in the city council and planning commission joint meeting last week, one of the takeaways, and I don't recall who made the statement, but they did reiterate that the goal would be to create code that preserves neighborhood character and go with a solution that's not necessarily market driven. And I would personally agree with that. And so, just throwing it out there, I would be in support of the minimum lot standards track for us, but I'd be curious as to what other commissioners think.
Thank you, Commissioner Stewart. Commissioner Lee?
It seems to me the state has set the stakes too high for municipalities to do anything but their minimum compliance track. And it seems to me that my recommendation would be, along with Commissioner Stewart, to recommend that we somehow make our recommendations that we preserve the character of our neighborhoods, the trees, the design standards, not so much maybe, because we don't have the resources to do the alternative design standards or siting standards or performance metrics.
Thank you, Commissioner Lee. So you're, if I can summarize your suggestion, it's to follow the minimum compliance track for lot size and density, but then also the minimum compliance track for design standards too.
I don't see if they say the approval is complex and difficult to achieve, it's like beating our heads against the wall and not knowing what the outcome will be for a lot of effort, money, and time spent.
Thank you, Commissioner Lee. I do get the sense that the commission is generally moving in that direction, both for the minimum compliance track for lot size and density, as well as the minimum compliance track for design standards too. Commissioners, any differing opinions or input?
Yes.
Commissioner Beckett, yeah.
I think we have a very complex city when you look at areas as different as the Mountain Park and the various waterfront properties. And the staff ought to look at what design standards would be appropriate to fit those neighborhoods, which may not be the minimum compliance.
Thank you, Commissioner Beckett. Director Siegel.
Thank you, Chair Heap. Yeah, I wanted to emphasize, and I know that Jamin had commented on this during the study session, that within the minimum compliance track, you actually have quite a bit of flexibility in the types of design standards or design controls. And I'm speaking about the minimum compliance track for design standards, not so much on the siting side, but on the design standards, we have a lot of flexibility in how we regulate middle housing, provided we're also looking at single family housing when we're adopting, additional requirements. So we didn't really get too deep into the substance of this tonight, and you have another study or another work session scheduled for the 14th of June on this. So you might consider, of those design standards, which ones would you like the advisory committee to come back with specific recommendations on design standards that might be changes or additions to what we currently have. You talked a little bit about trees tonight. There are all of these other dimensions of siting and building design, primarily that could be really critical to making sure middle housing fits into our neighborhoods. I think in your presentation, Eric, you had some bullet points, right, that the council and those commissioners who attended the study session had commented on. Did you want to bring those up? Would that be helpful?
I think, Jamin, you'd have to stop sharing your screen.
Yeah, so I think those are the points that, and you could continue the conversation on the 14th of June if you'd like, but I think these are the topics that.
So are you talking about from the, I think.
No, not that one. I'm sorry. There was something on building design and trees. It had a list of.
There you go.
Yeah, there it is. Right. So, if the commissioners had any thoughts based on what you've heard from Jamin on areas that we should focus.
Commissioners, feedback? Commissioner Lee?
I think one of the topics that Jamin brought up in his presentation, as far as design standards, was, and he called it foundational landscaping, that made the building come to be less impactful to the ground by softening it with good landscaping, which when as it matures makes it look more as a part of the neighborhood, as opposed to a developer slapping up some bark dust and one, vine maple and calling it good.
Thank you, Commissioner Lee. Commissioner Sumler?
I think the preservation of existing homes has real legs, especially if the community has said that they want to try and preserve the character of the community itself. If we're able to retrofit or change existing homes into these middle housing, it would behoove the neighbors and the community in general. So I think that would be one of the biggest takeaways from the presentation for me and pushing forward.
Thank you. Vice Chair Pepe?
Yeah, I would just echo what Commissioner Sumler just said and really look at the preservation of existing homes and in opposition of tearing down a home and having that demolition expense be paid. Find some way to incentivize a developer to come in and remodel existing to fit the middle income.
I guess I could add, one thing I found interesting was the first bullet there with minimizing the visual impact of the garages, driveways, and then also the parking. I thought in the report there was one suggestion that we actually look at, options such as clustered parking, rear load garages. That actually looked like something that would definitely help, fit in to the community and maintain the character of the community. So I'd encourage further, evaluation of those aspects.
I have a kind of a probing question on the comment on architecture. So we heard from the neighborhood survey that architectural style is not as important as specific styles are not as important as having homes that fit into the neighborhood, and a variety of styles is perhaps valued more than having a uniform style. The comment here is, should this effort be looking at encouraging a higher level of design than would otherwise be required with incentives? And some of the examples that were suggested, I think there were some council members, perhaps some commissioners as well, who were not all that interested in adding lot coverage or floor area or larger buildings for additional architectural detailing, for example. So I don't know where the commission is at on that. This balance between having flexibility or offering flexibility and achieving a higher level of design. So that's something that the committee could spend quite a bit of time on. I think it'd be helpful for them to know at the outset if that's something the commission is interested in pursuing.
Any feedback to Director Siegel's question on the flexibility of design? Vice Chair Pepe.
Did Commissioner Stewart have? I think his hand was raised first.
I was going to see if anybody wanted to directly respond to Director Siegel's question, and then come back to
sorry,
general other questions. Yeah,
I can't remember the name of the developer. I think it was TTM who showed us some examples of duplex that he built in the First Edition area, and it looked like it was actually single-family homes kind of joined it at one wall. But would highly encourage whatever is developed to look or resemble a single-family residential home as much as possible, rather than a very modern 4 or 6 wall type structure with very straight sides and very, very modern looking, which doesn't necessarily resemble any of the neighborhoods currently right now in our city.
Commissioner Stewart, any comments?
Yeah, my comment actually was sort of dovetailing off of what Director Siegel was speaking about concerning context-sensitive architecture. When I read that, I think more about issues of scale, right? I think I've heard a lot of people around that are concerned about just disparity in scale between older homes and newer houses that are being constructed. So I think this statement here, when it talks about context-sensitive architecture, can be more about issues of scale as opposed to style.
Thank you, Commissioner Stewart. Commissioners, any other feedback? So I think this is a great list, Eric. Thanks for sharing it. And I think hopefully we've given some direction to staff. And then, I'd ask all the commissioners to consider that, before our next meeting in June, and then come back, as Director Siegel and staff was asking, with any further recommendations we'd have on specific, design type of criteria we'd like to give. Right. Iris, one last check. Was there anyone that wished to provide public comment tonight? Did anybody indicate so?
No, none.
All right. So at this time, I'd like to close the public comment session. And I think Director Siegel, you had another comment you'd like to provide.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. This is really helpful. So between now and the 14th, we'll do some research into the questions that some of the commissioners had about ADA compliance, or what accommodations would need to be made by a homeowner who's offering multiple units for rent. If there are other questions or follow-up research items that the commissioners would like us to pursue, feel free to contact Eric or myself, between now and, or over the next week, I should say, and we're happy to provide that research.
Thank you. So, Jamin, thank you for coming out and giving your presentation tonight from Cascadia Partners to the Planning Commission. It was an excellent presentation, and we really thank you for all your work and time that you provided to the city. Thanks very much.
Thank you for having me.
So at this point, I'd like to conclude our work session tonight on House Bills 2001 and 2003. Thanks to all the commissioners for participating. We'll move on to the next agenda item, which is other business. Director Siegel, any other business that we'd like to raise tonight?
Not tonight, thank you, Chair.
All right, and then next is item number 9 on the agenda, schedule review.
Yeah, thank you. Your next meeting is Monday, June 14th, and you have 2 items scheduled. One is the second work session on House Bills 2001 and 2003 following this evening's presentation. And the second item is a public hearing on an application for zoning code amendments and map amendments at the Boones Ferry Road construction staging site. That is a quasi-judicial review application. So Attorney Boone may have some comments or advice. The only thing I would say is that because it's a quasi-judicial hearing, you'll be asked at the hearing if you've had any ex parte contacts. Of course, if you have any conflict of interest or bias. So it's a little different than the legislative hearings that you typically have, in that ex parte contact and bias are 2 factors that you will need to be able to respond to whether or not you have any any issues there. So that's all I have to say on the hearing.
Thank you, Director Siegel. Attorney Boone, any comments on ex parte contacts?
Well, don't. The format, I mean, typically you meet in the legislative session, legislative mode, and that is, you know, you can wander about the community and sort of gather the sense of the community. You'll receive input at the Planning Commission hearings, but you may receive them elsewhere, and it's all good. And you bring in your own personal biases and goals and missions and et cetera, et cetera. Now, when you're doing quasi-judicial, it's like, it's quasi-judicial, not quite judicial, but almost, in that you're supposed to, everybody's supposed to bring the evidence evidence that you are to consider before you in the hearing, put it into the record so that everybody knows what you got, what information you received, so they can rebut the evidence they think is incorrect. And so it should all be in the record for you. And then you don't apply your individual biases, you apply the criteria. And that is, it either meets the criteria or it doesn't. So that's why you don't go out and solicit or tell people not to provide comments to you. If people want to, you know, sometimes they approach you and say, I want to make a comment about this project. And the best answer to them is, don't tell me, because I can't get that information into the record and all the other commissioners need to hear it. You should put it in a letter. You should come to the meeting. You know, so that's how you get it in the record. So.
Well, thank you, Attorney Boone. All right. I think that was it. There's no further business on schedule review. I'd like to adjourn the meeting. Thanks everyone for attending tonight.
Thanks, everybody.
Good evening.
Have a good night.
Thank
Good
you.
night, everybody.
Bye.
Night, everybody.
Good night.